Okay. Good morning. You are literally hearing the first words out of my mouth all day. Got some coffee here with me, and I wanted to get going and get finished with this paper, not let too much time pass before I kept reading it, so that I have everything still in mind. So yesterday, I read the first half of this, or some of the questions. The questions were around how how does this explicit interpretation aspect of theory relate to experiencing, and how do they interact, and how does the explicit interpretations, how do those become, he doesn't say it this way, but like internalized, so that they influence one's actual felt experiencing, right? Because he also says that from the client-centered approach, an assumption about therapy is that therapeutic change happens in the experiencing, not in the interpretations and concepts and things that are said, right? Therapeutic change occurs in terms of felt, present experiencing, not the concepts. So how do the concepts, when you're doing interpretation, how do they come to change anything and have some effect on experiencing? So this discussion has attempted to show that counselor responses may aim at depth, either in the sense of depth of theoretically posited repressed experience, or in the sense of implicitly present depth of felt experiencing. The difference between them lies in whether or not the counselor's response refers to the client's present experiencing. We need theoretical terms about this reference to present experiencing. We need theoretical terms about this reference to present experiencing. With the aid of such terms, we can more precisely state the issue between interpretation and client-centered response. We can make explicit the following currently implicit assumptions of the client-centered view: that A, experiencing is vital to therapeutic change; B, the more deeply a client feels, refers to, and conceptualizes his present experiencing, the more therapeutic change is occurring, which is effectively what focusing is. C, what the client ought to deal with is probably implicit in his present experiencing, or it will soon appear in his present experiencing if he deeply feels and refers to what is now implicitly present, and if he is deeply responded to. Right, so rather than being like, well, what you need to deal with is your mommy and daddy issues, even though that's not like in your mind at all right now. It's not something that you're thinking about or bothering you. The idea is that what is worth dealing with in a therapeutic context is like there for him in his current experience. If he refers to what's going on in his body, what's like alive for him, so to speak, it will take the client to what he needs to work on in therapy. D, what is felt and present but is only implicit can be conceptualized. E, Anything which brings the client's attention closer to his felt present experiencing aids therapy, while anything which moves him away from present experiencing to a more conceptual, intellectualized level is obstructive to therapy. So moving him away from that direct reference to his own body and his own experience, right? Away from the intricacy, the intricate, particular aspects of his own experience and into concepts and abstraction. And then F, interpretations of anything which is not now implicit in the client's present experiencing are therefore obstructive to therapy. Right? Because you're theorizing about something which is not even present in the moment. So in a way, basically, you're theorizing upon an abstraction. So you're like 2 levels removed from what the hell is actually going on in the person in front of you as the therapist. It just occurred to me as I was reading all these, since it's so much of this is like how focusing is described, I realized that I don't think Gendlin had developed and named focusing at this point. It's too early for that. So focusing didn't exist. That's why he's talking so much about experiencing. He had his ideas and stuff, and he was working on his ideas, but it seems like focusing itself as a name for a practice did not exist. So that's good to keep in mind. Okay. It would clarify the issue greatly if it could be investigated in this explicit fashion. I am uncertain whether interpretive therapists would disagree with any or all of points A through F. Perhaps they also implicitly assume them, but have their own method of using interpretations without thereby obstructing the patient's present experiencing. Yeah, that's kind of, I would be interested in, people who are, for example, more into like Jungian psychology, which I really have no experience with. I haven't even really read Jung at all, pretty much at all. But obviously, don't expect this to be listened to by a bunch of Jungian people, but it would excuse me. It would be interesting to know how much of these assumptions here, Jungians, would agree with or disagree with or have their own perspective on. Okay. Is a good interpretation different from a good client-centered response? Fenchel has described the analytic interpretation as follows. Since interpretation means helping something unconscious by naming it at the moment it is striving to break through, effective interpretations can be given only at one specific point, namely, where the patient's immediate interest is momentarily centered. Interpretation means helping something unconscious by naming it at the moment it is striving to break through, right? So it's like it's behind the veil, right? It's like hidden behind the shroud in a way, but it's poking at it. And maybe you can even see the like if you have a sheet and you're poking your finger from underneath the sheet, you can see your finger poking through, but you can't see your finger necessarily. And so by naming the thing and giving an interpretation to what it is that might be poking, you allow it to break through and to be seen. But you only can do that, or at least as this quote is suggesting, you only do that effectively when the poking is actually happening, if it's trying to come through. But if you just use the interpretation without anything poking through it, you're talking about something that's totally not there. So that's interesting, that there is this specific moment when interpretations are valuable, and only at that moment. It reminds me of the Nicomachean Ethics, doing the right thing in the right way, at the right time, in the right context, with the right person. Okay. A good interpretation is said to be one for which the patient is ready. What can be meant by ready? As Fenichel shows, what must be meant is that the patient is nearly able to have the experiencing to which the interpretation refers. The therapist must be able to determine when this is the case. How could he determine it other than by listening to the patient and noting when what is to be interpreted is nearly implicit in what the patient is already aware of? If this is how it is done, then good interpretation would differ from a client-centered response only in two rather unimportant ways. Let me get clear on what was just said. Okay, so if a good interpretation is only going to work at that perfect moment when the thing wants to break through, then the therapist has to know when that moment is, and they have to be listening closely, right? Okay, so then if that's the case, then a good interpretation would differ from good client-centered response in only two rather unimportant ways. One, rather than responding to what is now implicit, as the client-centered therapist would do, the interpretive therapist lets the implicit go by, making a mental note that the patient is nearly ready for an interpretation. Later, the therapist makes the interpretation. 2. Rather than attributing the therapeutic change to the client's reference, conceptualization, and grappling with his experiencing, the interpretive therapist attributes this change to the interpretation. However, he is likely to help the patient emotionally absorb the interpretation. This must mean that he spends some time responding to and conceptualizing the patient's present experiencing around the interpretation, just as the client-centered therapist does when he responds to the client's implicitly expressed experiencing. Okay. So, whereas in focusing, or since this is before focusing existed, whereas in a client-centered situation, the whole idea would be to have the client continuously speaking to the intricacy of his present experiencing, moment by moment. What is going on in him? What is he noticing? Right, and then the therapist is reflecting that back. In the interpretive approach, the therapist is just watching closely for that implicit stuff, listening closely for that implicit stuff, but maybe is not, reflecting it back, maybe is not guiding the client to speak to it explicitly or attempt to speak to it. But then when the therapist recognizes that this thing wants to break through the subconscious, right? Right, when he has, it's basically like the therapist kind of doing the focusing for the client while skipping a bunch of steps, at least like without saying out loud a bunch of steps, right? It's like, okay, I, the therapist, am watching and listening to you, the client, and I'm noticing what you're saying, how you're saying it, the sound of your voice, etc. And I am like getting handles for what that is, and I am like coming up with interpretations for like what must be going on theoretically, to explain all this implicit stuff that I'm noticing in you. And then when I judge that the time is right, I then share with you my interpretation of everything that I've been noticing. And that interpretation, in some way, allows you, as the client, to then make sense of all of the stuff that you've been sharing. Right. So that's still an open question. Is like, how does the actual interpretation make a difference to the client? Like, what does the interpretation provide? And how does the client take it in? He does mention, like, the therapist is likely to help the patient emotionally absorb the interpretation. So he spends some time responding to and conceptualizing the patient's present experiencing around the interpretation, right? So it's like, okay, I've just laid it on to you. It's like, this is what seems to be the case, my interpretation of everything that you're telling me. And then you have your own, response to that. It's like, okay, that's what you're telling me. Now I have my experience of hearing that. Maybe it's triggering to me, maybe it makes some things make sense, and I have emotions around that, and then the therapist is going to help me like incorporate and spend time with my present experiencing around the interpretation. Yeah, just as a client-centered therapist would do around each step. Yeah, so it's like, instead of doing it step by step, you wait until the interpretation seems worth sharing, and then you kind of do focusing around the interpretation. But again, this is all fairly theoretical on Gendlin's part, right? Like, it must be this way for interpretive therapists. If the above is a fair description of good interpretation, then it would be fair to say that interpretation is good when it mostly approximates an optimal client-centered response. Well, we're already at conclusions. So this discussion has tried to show that the issue concerning interpretation in therapy involves the problem of whether and how present experiencing, as opposed to concepts, functions in therapeutic change. If therapeutic change is viewed mainly as a conceptual process, then depth of response consists of concepts about deeply repressed dynamics, and interpretation is said to help conceptualize them. On the other hand, if therapeutic change is viewed as a process of experiencing, then depth of response means direct reference, feeling, and conceptualization of present experiencing of the feelings and meanings implicit in it. In that view, interpretations are seen as failing to refer to and conceptualize present experiencing. So depth, again, back to that two ways of thinking about depth. Depth in terms of, it's almost like the level of abstraction, right? The more abstract you go from the actual situation of the person, right? He gives the example of Oedipal dynamics, right? It's like you go from your actual life where you're like getting in arguments with your neighbor, and then you abstract from that all the way to talking about your Oedipus complex with your mother and your father. That's depth, because it's like, in a way, like more essential, I guess. All of the, right? Like there is a way in which you can think about depth being like when you do away with all of the particulars and all the noise, right? That is a way of thinking about, right? It's like noise versus signal, right? Like all the noise doesn't matter. Or like, this is kind of the thing that I've been wondering about with the whole 80-20 principle, is like, with that, the idea is often like, okay, just figure out the 20% that makes all the difference and just focus on that and do more of that, and the other 80% of factors don't matter. But that strikes me as extremely antithetical to systems thinking, where it's like, yeah, the other 80% of the system makes no difference. Like, nah, that's not how that works. And if you just load up on the 20% that's obviously making all the difference, you're gonna make some changes to the system that don't have obvious consequences. But yeah, so that's like a way of talking about depth in terms of concept, is like, do away with all the particulars, all the messiness of the actual real life situation, and boil it down to only the essential concepts, right? For example, the Oedipal relationships. It's like, what is going on in your situation now that is representative of this core dynamic between you and your parents, right? Let's boil it down. Let's get deep in that respect. So it's yeah. On the other hand, depth for a client-centered approach is depth in terms of like high definition. Depth as in fine-grained perception of what's going on right now, right? So it's almost the opposite. You're not abstracting at all. You're getting more aware of all the particulars. Right, you're zooming in. You're zooming in, or you're just like heightening the resolution of your ability to perceive your current experiencing, but you're not abstracting from it at all. So you're turning up the resolution and maybe going, zooming in as well, and then you're talking about what you see without abstracting from it. So the big question or big difference there that I'm seeing that he didn't necessarily say is just like that one approach sees all of the particulars of what's going on right now as being essential, and the other kind of sees those as noise. So the whole idea of what is signal and what is noise in the two different approaches is kind of at odds. So we have added to the current discussion of interpretation in therapy a new theoretical term, experiencing. By referring to experiencing, we have attempted to state explicitly what the client-centered response is. We have tried to show how such a response aids the client to deep therapeutic change. At the same time, we have raised some explicit questions about interpretations. How do interpretations differ from mere failures to help the patient work with, deeply refer to, and conceptualize what is now implicit in his present experiencing? Right, so it's acknowledging that interpretations aren't just abstract and useless. They sometimes very much do help the patient. They are not mere failures to help the patient, the client, do this stuff, right? So how do they work when they work? We have stated the vital role of experiencing in therapeutic change. In terms of this role of experiencing, we have shown how the client-centered response attempts to refer to and conceptualize what is implicitly felt in present experiencing. We have also asked how interpretations can possibly be helpful in doing so, unless they also are attempts to refer to and conceptualize present experiencing. So this is interesting. I think, right, that Eugene here is saying that, because again, he was doing graduate work with Carl Rogers, who is the founder of client-centered therapy. But I haven't read Rogers, but I don't think that this concept, right, this name for this existed until Gendlin started talking about it, experiencing, right? So it's like you have client-centered approach, but then what is it that's going on within client-centered therapy that is making it work? What is being referred to, and what is the therapist helping to, get even clearer about? I don't know that there was a name for that until Gendlin started naming this concept of experiencing. Okay, so the following deals with a second issue, current discussions of which is obscured by the lack of a theoretical term that refers to experiencing. By introducing terms which refer to experiencing, a clarification of the issue will be attempted. Sweet. Let me reheat my coffee. Okay. So, the focus on the present. Here we are. Here's Rogers. So, Rogers and others assert that therapeutic change takes place to the greatest degree when the client experiences what he deals with in the present. Without a term referring to experiencing as something distinguishable from conceptualization, what does Rogers' emphasis on experiencing in the present mean? Because of the lack of precise terms, Rogers' emphasis on present experiencing has been widely misinterpreted to mean that a client need not deal with his past experience. In such a reading of this view, Rogers' reference to the present is taken to refer to conceptual content. Rogers is misunderstood to mean that a client need deal only with the content of his present life, not with his early experience. However, Rogers means that whatever the client deals with, past or present conceptual content, it is optimally dealt with only through present experiencing. This issue is obscured as long as theory has no terms which refer directly to experiencing. Once such a term is introduced, his view can be stated clearly. Both present and past conceptual contents can be dealt with in therapy by a client with intense present experiencing, or they can be merely discussed in a conceptual manner. Yeah, I think that makes sense without talking about it too much, but it does make me realize that, Rogers was trained, I might be wrong about this, but I think for the most part, Rogers was trained in psychology. And, well, if I can look it up, right? Biography. At the university, his first career choice was agriculture, followed by history, and then religion. Interesting. He became an atheist. Agnostic. Where's his... Okay. So he got an MA and then a PhD from a teacher's college. In what, though? While completing his doctoral work, education. So then doing stuff about cruelty to children. Okay, and then shortly after that, wrote the clinical treatment of the problem child. So he was basically building client-centered approach for post-Freudian psychotherapeutic practice of auto-rank. I don't know much about auto-rank, but yeah, that's worth looking into. And then Jessie Taft, again, I don't know too much about her. Okay. In 1940, Rogers became the professor of clinical psychology at Ohio State University, where he wrote his second book, Counseling and Psychotherapy. There we go. Okay. And then, here's where Gendlin comes in. You probably can't see this very well. So, in 1945, he was invited to set up a counseling center at the University of Chicago. In 1947, he was elected the president of the American Psychological Association. While a professor of psychology at the University of Chicago, Rogers helped to establish a counseling center connected with the university and there conducted studies to determine the effectiveness of his methods. His findings and theories appeared in Client-Centered Therapy and Psychotherapy and Personality Change. One of his graduate students at the University of Chicago, Thomas Gordon, established the Parent Effectiveness Training movement. Interesting. Never heard of that. Another student, Eugene Gendlin, who was getting his PhD in philosophy, that's what I wanted to point out, was the difference, right, is that Rogers was trained in and focused on psychology, and Gendlin was philosophy. So Gendlin brought to the table this like extremely disciplined, fine-grained approach of thinking about concepts and the philosophical implications around Rogers' work, right? So let's go back here. So talking about the concepts and the language and the terms that don't exist within Rogers' work that are making it hard to really explicate what is meant and lead to misunderstandings. That's much of what Gendlin was bringing to the table, at least early. I mean, going only off my reading so far, But Rogers didn't have that term for experiencing, so Gendlin was creating that. But yeah, so Rogers was talking about, things need to be dealt with in the present, but he didn't have this term for experiencing, so people were misinterpreting him to mean that you only talk about what's going on in the person's life now, and you never talk about, old experiences and memories and childhood experiences, which is a misinterpretation. And Gendlin's specifying here, it's not that you don't refer to that stuff, it's that you can refer to that stuff and talk about that stuff in a way which is still focused on present moment experiencing, right? You're focusing on or maintaining awareness of how that stuff is affecting you and living in you now, right? How does it feel? Like these memories about your relationship with your parents, what's the experience of that now? Of course we can talk about it, but we're not going to talk about it in a totally abstract way. We're talking about it with reference to your current experiencing, what's going on in your body, how you feel right now. So now, in common sense language, both clients and therapists talk of experiencing as distinct from conceptualization. Hence, research was possible on this question. In a recent research, counselors were asked to rate the amount of clients' immediate experiencing on a 9-point scale, the extremes of which were, respectively, express feelings of the moment and talk about feelings past or present. Let me reread that. In a recent research, counselors were asked to rate the amount of clients' immediate experiencing on a 9-point scale, the extremes of which were, respectively, on one hand, express feelings of the moment, and on the other hand, talk about feeling past or present. So express what's happening now, or talk about feelings. Examples of client statements were given to further define the question, which at this stage of theory could not be precisely stated, namely, regardless of what the conceptual content may be, how much expression of present experiencing do you observe? In order to further distinguish this scale from the question of past or present conceptual content, another scale was employed to measure to what extent do the client's problems focus in the past, childhood or earlier years. As predicted, the scale measuring expression of immediate experiencing correlated highly with several success measures, while the scale of past or present content did not. Okay. So regardless of what the conceptual content may be, how much expression of present experiencing do you observe? Yeah. And the scale measuring expression of immediate experiencing correlated highly with several success measures. Okay. So suddenly there's a number 3 here. I don't know what that is. Was there a 2 that I'm not seeing? Let me see. Okay, so that's 2. That's not right. I don't know what this 3 is referring to. But I'll just keep reading. So, to what extent do the problems focus in the past? And then here's the scale. 1, much concern with the past. 9, most concern with recent or present. And then, to what extent does the client express his feelings, and to what extent does he rather talk about them? This scale differentiates direct expression from report about one's feelings, regardless of whether the feeling is past or present. So on this side, you have, I hate you, it comes home to me now how scared I really was last night. Gee, I feel low. And on the other hand, so that's the expression, right? And then on the other side of the scale, I have this feeling of hate, and it's for you. I was scared last night. Often I feel depressed. And then in parentheses, no indication of present feeling in either words or voice. So on one side, present expression of feeling. On the other side, just talking about feelings that have existed but are not necessarily occurring in the person at the moment. So this type of research shows the possibility of measuring the counselor's observation of clients experiencing as something different from conceptualizations. We have shown that it was possible to distinguish conceptual content dealing with an individual's present life from present experiencing, regardless of past or present conceptual content. In this way, we attempted to clarify the issue regarding the Rogerian therapeutic focus on the present. Sorry, that didn't somehow bounced off my head. We have shown that it was possible to distinguish conceptual content, dealing with an individual's present life, from present experiencing, regardless of past or present conceptual content. In this way, we attempted to clarify the issue regarding the Rogerian therapeutic focus on the present. Okay. It is clear that the Rogerian focus on the present means a focus on present experiencing in therapy, not on present or past conceptual content. Again, we note that client-centered theory implicitly assumes that therapeutic change occurs in terms of present experiencing. This can be stated simply if theoretical terms refer to present experiencing as well as to conceptualizations. Whether the conceptual content is past or present, experiencing occurs in the present in the therapy situation. Present experiencing has a vital function in therapeutic change. All right, so whether we're talking about the Oedipal dynamics between yourself and your parents, or we're talking about this situation with your neighbor that happened yesterday, or we're talking about the anger that you feel today, right now, the experiencing, which plays a vital function in therapeutic change, the experiencing of any of that we're talking about occurs in the present, right now, literally at this moment by moment. And if you don't refer to that, you're talking in abstraction, purely conceptual, without referring to where the therapeutic change actually occurs. So, the two issues we have discussed, interpretation and focus on the present, illustrate the many issues which center around the function of experiencing in therapy. The discussions attempted to show both the vital role of experiencing in therapeutic change and the need in theory for terms which refer to experiencing. Okay, so we got some footnotes here. I'm just going to skim them. I'm not going to read them all out, but maybe there's something worth talking about. So I remember him talking about how change can come simply from feeling something all the way through. And I think this is kind of what he's referring to there, is that by putting our attention on a feeling and a felt sense and feeling it all the way, in the sense of like really turning up the resolution and experiencing it fully, allows, so that, that's it allows the flow, which he was talking about in that process concept of relationship. It allows the flow in the process to resume, basically, when you give attention to your felt sense in that way, because you're basically allowing the movement of it from unconscious, or sort of in that border zone of being something that you're aware of but can't talk about quite, and allowing that through more and more attention to become clear, to become something that you can conceptualize. And so merely by attending to something fully, feeling it deeply, feeling it all the way through, you allow movement to occur. You allow the processes within you to flow, and change is a consequence of that. So experience is kind of like I mean, one obvious difference between these two things is experience is a that noun, and experiencing is, I don't know what the technical name for this type of word is, just like an active verb, basically, right? It's ongoing. It's happening, right? I went on a run, which is a thing that I did, versus I am running, right? It's happening. And so in one case, you are trying to take all of a person, all of their life, all of their living experience, and sum it up into a thing that you can point to as a concept, as a noun, as opposed to thinking about all of that stuff as ongoing, moment by moment, never complete. Not something that you can sum up. Experiencing, on the other hand, includes much of what is not explicit, but refers to what is aware, although chiefly felt and implicit. This one seems interesting. Fenichel and others similarly speak of a defensive kind of acceptance by the patient of therapist interpretations. This means the patient conceptually accepts the interpretation in order to be done with the problem and thus avoid dealing with it himself. That is, in order to avoid the experiencing of it. Thus, a certain form of resistance consists in the patient always being reasonable and refusing to have any understanding for the logic of emotions. He may make progress in understanding the forces working within him, sense connections, and dig up new childhood recollections, and yet there is no change in his neuroses. Or the patient may have understood what his associations and the analyst's interpretations showed him, and yet the knowledge remains entirely separated from his real life. Or a patient may accept everything the analyst tells him merely as a matter of courtesy, but it is also just this courteous attitude which protects him from reliving to the full his instinctual conflicts. Oh man, that is good. I think I'm literally gonna add a screenshot of that to my when I post this video on Twitter. Both Rogers and Fenichel's observations can be stated only by terms that refer directly to experiencing as such. Without such a term, how could one state the difference between a defensively intellectual acceptance of an interpretation and a genuine one? Except with reference to actual experiencing. It's like, are you actually feeling anything about this interpretation, or are you just saying, yeah? And if you're sensitive to like listening to a person with your whole self more than just the words, you can often tell if a person is actually affected in the moment by something, whether or not they say they are. Okay. All right, all done. So that was 2 functions of experiencing, 2 issues, interpretation in therapy, and focus on the present. So if you have listened to this, I am surprised, and I'm also grateful. So thank you, and have a wonderful weekend, or whatever day it is. Have a wonderful time with whatever you do next. All right, till next time.